I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I love that gospel from the Gospel of John. I love parties, love weddings. It sort of makes me think of my wedding, which Deborah and I are celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary this year in June. I know, it's pretty amazing. You're as surprised as... No, I'm just kidding. So I was thinking about the wedding, and I don't remember a lot of the service, actually, but I do remember the party afterward. And I remember my mother is an incredible decorator, sort of interior design and arts and crafts, and she's very creative and talented. And so she created the table decorations for the reception. And one of the things she did was she went to antique stores and thrift stores and sourced little candlesticks of various sizes and materials. Most of them were silver-plated or brass or, just all sorts of different things, and had them arranged in a very aesthetically pleasing way all over the table, and everyone was raving about them. And my dad, toward the end of the party, was looking around and was thinking, I don't want all these candlesticks around the house. And so he, on the cuff, had this wonderful idea of auctioning them off. And he got up and stood on a chair or something and started auctioning these things. And all the proceeds, of course, went to Deborah and I. And we actually made a lot of money, which is cool. But I think Deborah and my mom were a little bit embarrassed by all of that. But anyway, that was my dad. But it's interesting that the service. I think I was so nervous that I didn't remember the service. But the party, I kind of remember that. And in Jesus' day, the party also was kind of the thing. This is taking place in the Gospel of John. It's taking place in a neighboring town of Nazareth. So this is where Jesus, grew up, but it's not far away, a couple of miles. And you can imagine that because this is a close-knit community and everyone's sort of related, that people from all over the surrounding kind of villages gather together. And it's close, but they're still walking a few miles, and so you got to make it worth it. And they would actually spend several days partying, and there'd be multiple meals, and so it's such an interesting and telling setting for what is Jesus's first miracle. Now, John doesn't call them miracles. John calls them signs. And John is very intentional. It's not that John is saying that there weren't other miracles, but John is very intentional in choosing 7 particular signs. And it's, he's sort of making a theological argument. And so to begin with this sign, he says, this is the first sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. He is beginning a theological statement with this. And you can see all of the symbolism and all the things that we can draw out of it. This happens on the 3rd day, for instance, and that isn't a coincidence, right? And so Jesus is here at this party, this wedding party, and maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but it kind of seems like he's not that into it. Mary is there, she's into it, but Jesus is maybe not all that particularly into the party. But you gotta love Mary, the authority, the faith that she displays, because this is Jesus' first sign, this is his first miracle, but Mary knows who he is and what he can do. And so when they run out of wine, which seems like, I'm sure to the bride and groom, or particularly to the wedding planner or the steward or whoever, this was like career-ending disaster. But in the grand scheme of things, right? Matthew and John, they start out with Jesus casting out demons. Or, I'm sorry, not John, Mark. They started with Jesus casting out demons, healing people. But John, presents us with this relatively tame and quotidian problem. They've run out of wine. Big deal. And that's kind of Jesus' attitude. But Mary says, they've run out of wine. And Jesus says, well, what's that to me? What's that to you? And she ignores him. Can you imagine ignoring Jesus? That is the honor and the privilege that only the Mother of God can have, right? And she says to the servants, just do whatever he tells you to do. And of course, then Jesus does what his mother tells him to do, and that is solve this wine problem. And so that's one thing. And I've always been struck by a Roman Catholic theologian, Hans von Balthasar, if you really want to know his name, who said that Mary is the church's first and greatest theologian. And her entire theological project, some theologians, including him, write 20, 30, 40 books, right? Whole bookshelves full of books about theology, and they never exhaust the subject of God and who God is. But he said Mary's whole theological corpus was this: do whatever he tells you to do. And that truly is the best, and maybe, I think we can agree that the shortest might be the best, right? But behind that statement, like I said, is her absolute trust in who Jesus is. And so Jesus has these guys fill up these huge stone jars, 20, 30 gallons apiece, right? Which, if you do the math, that is 600 to 900 standard bottles of wine. That is a lot of wine. And they had already gone through, apparently, a lot of more than they were expecting to. And so, never mind. So I was going to make an Episcopalian joke, but I won't. But when we step back and we think about the theological purpose, remember, John is trying to tell us something about who Jesus is and who God is as revealed in Jesus. And so we start to think about the excess of that. We're in this party, which is already in excess, right? A party is by very definition, a party is more than essential, right? It is in excess. It is an overflow of human joy. And that in itself is a very revealing thing. God first reveals God's glory in Jesus Christ in this moment of joy and excess. Isn't that wonderful? How God blesses our gathering and our moments of joy and our moments of happiness and our moments of celebrating a new family, a new life. God is there and God reveals himself. And God doesn't just reveal himself with, here's your nice little bottle that you show up to a party with, here's your sort of hostess gift. No, God reveals himself with 900 bottles of wine. And that tells us something about who God is and what God does. God does not do anything half measure. When God shows up, when God pours out God's abundance, it is a big deal. It's super abundant, it is more than abundant. It is in excess of abundance. That is the grace and the mercy and the love that God has poured out on the world in Jesus Christ. It's interesting in John that Mary only shows up 2 times. Now, in the other Gospels, she has more lines, as it were. She comes to Jesus. Actually, her and his other family comes to Jesus and tells Jesus to kind of tamp it down a little bit in Matthew, right? But in John, Mary only shows up twice. She shows up at the beginning, and she shows up at the end. She shows up here at the wedding of Cana, because there is no birth story in John. So this is toward the beginning of the book. And she's here, and she says her earth-shattering line, right? Do everything he tells you to do. And then she shows up at the end when Jesus is on the cross, actively dying, actively being tortured. and she's there. She doesn't look away. She is at the cross. She's one of the only people who do not abandon Jesus at the cross. It's her, several other women, which is another important theological point, and the disciple John. And John, like I said, has these 7 signs, and there's this theological movement, but the 8th sign, the 8th great act of God, is that crucifixion, that revealing of God's glory as the suffering servant, the one who dies on the cross for the sins of the world. And Mary, it is very telling, is there at the beginning, the first revelation of God's glory, and at the end of the gospel. And she is, in both cases, pointing to who Jesus is and to what Jesus does and to what that means, not just for her, not just for the people who lived then, but for all of us. And that's sort of our role as well. We are called as holy apostles, as followers of Jesus, to not save the world, to not save the party, to not show up and turn water into wine, but we are simply called to point to call attention to the ways that God's abundance has changed our life, to the ways that God is working in the world even now. And when we pay attention to that, we realize that God is there in those joyful moments of life, in the parties, in the weddings, in the baptisms, in all of the wonderful and joyous and abundant moments of life. God is there working, and God's abundance is above and beyond our imagination. But God is also there at the end, at the crucifixion. God is there on the cross, suffering alongside humanity, suffering in solidarity with humanity, suffering at the hands of humanity. God is there, and God's abundance is poured out in no less measure on the cross than at the wedding. God's abundance is poured out in God's very own blood. John is also the gospel that tells us about the centurion stabbing Jesus aside with the spear, and blood and water are poured out. Kind of an interesting symbolic connection between the beginning and the end of the gospel. God is with us in the joyous moments. God is with us in our suffering and in the suffering of the whole world. God is always with us. God is always offering God's mercy and love and grace, and there simply is no end to it. All we are called to do, all we have to do, is look and see it, point it out, carry other people to that abundance. Amen.